Shadows from Boot Hill by L. Ron Hubbard. On a hot afternoon in August, Brazos chased his shadow toward Los Hornos at a speed which indicated that all the devils from hell, and maybe even some angels, were hot upon him. He fled with more fury than fright, for it seemed to him that the murder of a banker ought to be considered in the light of public good. 2. He nursed a feeling of grievance, for the law had been so swift and determined that he had not even had time to collect the $500 in double eagles, which was to have been his pay for the job. The buckskin money belt was light beneath his buckskin shirt, just as both Peacemaker and Martini Henry were empty at belt and saddle side. And this was a hell of a country to try to get lost in. And Los Hornos, ahead, was about as safe a sanctuary as a barrel of sidewinders. Brazos swore at his luck, swore at his horse, and swore at his shadow. He cursed the sage, he cursed the dust, and he spat into the unoffending eye of a horned toad by the way. If he had good sense, he'd lair up south to the border, but if he had better sense, he'd crack a Wells Fargo safe before he went. For visitors in the land of the dawns were welcome in proportion to their purses. Los Hornos came writhing into sight amid its heat waves. Brazos looked over his shoulder in anxiety. The posse thought he would have to head for Los Hornos, and the posse had a couple of Apache trackers along to confirm its guess. And this horse, which he had stolen from a sheep herder, which didn't make it theft, wouldn't last another league. He had to stop in Los Hornos or be stopped. His quirt fell and the weary mustang sped along. Who did he know in Los Hornos? Only one man, Whisper Monahan. A slight shudder of premonition went over Brazos, and, because he believed in premonition, he did not take the symptom in good light. The last time he'd worked for Whisper Monahan, they had not parted the best of friends. But a posse is a posse, and a half-friend is better than an enemy with gun smoke in his fist, and so Brazos went streaming into the main street of Los Hornos. A couple of Indian dogs leaped out of slumber and from under his hoofs with dismal yelps. A loafer in the shade of the store porch went right on sleeping. There was a sign, Star Livery Stable, Whisper Monahan, Proprietor. Brazos swung the horse, and the moist warmth and dimness of the stable swallowed him. In the office, Whisper Monahan and a hostler named Henry looked languidly at the opening door, and then came fully awake. For a few seconds, the silence was very deep. Whisper Monahan was built close to the ground, and not all the sun in the southwest could have turned his pasty pallor into anything but a pasty pallor. But awkward and scared as he seemed, he always got what he wanted, no matter the methods he had to use. Brazos was inclined to be truculent. He wasn't very tall, but he wasn't very thick either. And when men first looked at him, they thought him a forceful and powerful individual. His mouth was almost at 45 degrees with his face, and his eyes proclaimed a dislike for the world. And now, with his buckskin stained and his flat Texas hat gray with dust and his much-used, if at present empty, gun at his side, he looked ready to take on a regiment, having just finished off a brigade.
Hello, Brazos.
Hello, Whisper.
You come far and fast, Brazos.
I come with half the citizens of Tulos on my heels.
Well, now, Brazos, that's too bad. What happened?
Well, I killed a gent that needed killing, and I didn't even collect the double eagles. This country is going to hell for keeps.
Yeah, the law's getting the upper hand. Worse luck.
But you gotta cover me, Whisper.
Why?
Because I said you gotta.
Whisper grinned suddenly inside himself.
That's too bad, Brazos, but I reckon you just better keep riding.
My hoss is half dead, and I ain't going to keep riding.
Then you better start walking, Brazos.
You can't do this to me.
You ain't got a cartridge left in your belt, and most likely none in your gun. You better get going, Brazos, before them fellers come streaking in here and string you up.
You can't do this to me.
I'm doing it, Brazos.
But they'll kill me.
Whisper was laughing inside himself now, though he looked very contrite and sorrowful. Brazos wore a silver cross on a silver chain around his neck, and when Brazos got pushed to it, he generally fingered the cross in hopes it would bring him luck. Whisper saw him doing it and knew that he had his man.
Too bad. You better be going before they get here.
Now look, Whisper, ain't you always been my friend?
I've hired you once in a while.
Well, hire me again. I need help, and I need it bad.
Hire you? Shucks. I haven't got anything for you to do.
Sure you have, Whisper.
Whisper was hard put to keep looking thoughtful. Finally, he scrubbed at his head and spoke doubtfully.
Well, I could get you to kill Scotty Brant for me, but you wouldn't do that.
Why, sure I would, Whisper. Well, you gotta help me.
Well, just as a favor to you, I'll let you do it. I'll even pay you a couple $100 for the job.
Oh, that's what. I knew you'd help me.
Whisper had won, and he threw off his lethargy.
Henry, you saddle up Beans and ride hell for leather for the buttes. About dark, you cut back. Take the bed of Dead River to cover your trail and come home.
About an hour later, Brazos was lying in the hayloft, not daring to breathe, while Whisper discovered with shocked alarm that he had aided the escape of a criminal. But shortly Brazos breathed again, for the posse, hot for blood, went thundering out of town on the trail of Beans and Henry, flailing their jaded mounts and licking their chops as they envisioned the riddled corpse of one Brazos. Whisper stood in the door watching them become a cloud of dust. Whisper, down inside, was laughing, but not at the joke he had played on the posse. Boot Hill at Los Hornos had recently acquired 2 new mounds, a civic improvement upon which grateful rattlesnakes now sunned themselves against the time when grass would cover mounds and crude crosses alike. Below the marker, which read Whiskey Pete, reposed a lately unlucky gunman who had the misfortune of finding his right arm paralyzed at the very instant when he should have been making the swiftest draw of his life. The other tombstone had no name at all, for this lead slinger had come from afar. He had also been exceedingly lacking in luck, for to all appearances he had gone loco blind, and had placed 3 bullets through the front window of the Oven Saloon when he had meant them to go cunningly into the region where Scotty Brant's heart pumped Highland blood and whiskey through Scotty Brant's wiry body. Thus, Whisper Monahan grinned. The citizenry of Los Hornos, with the air of art critics, had been much puzzled by the demise of these 2 gentlemen from other realms. In the first place, Scotty Brant was slow and clumsy with a weapon. In the second place, Scotty Brant had to fire twice to hit a barn from the inside. In the third place, Scotty Brant had not been at all worried when informed of either encounter to be. For the past 2 years, Scotty Brant had been sitting on the headwaters of a rare stream, using a gentle chemical known as cyanide to extract gold from oxide ore. And for the past 2 years, therefore, the entire valley, which was usually made green by the flow of that precious water, had seen sudden death to all herds of sheep which might wander therein too. Very early, diverse sheepmen had sought to cause the demise of one Scotty Brant personally, and 3 had been buried in 3 months, thus establishing the project as one of those things which contained more danger than worth. Accordingly, and this is where Whisper Monahan fitted in, diverse sheepmen had been pleasantly willing to sell, for a ridiculous price, all the land bordering upon that stream, an area of some 4,000 acres. They had had in mind the swindling of one Whisper Monahan, a man not ordinarily on the sucker side of any deal. Hence, when Whisper had dug down, laughing to himself, and had received the deeds, he had promptly written to one Whiskey Pete, who, attracted by gain and not admiring the human race much anyway, promptly hied himself to Los Hornos, and nearly as promptly was given a 6-foot home with a nice view for rattlesnakes. The second man, not knowing about Whiskey Pete, had also sought to assuage the itching of his palm and had come off missing the top of his head. Not to be intimidated, Whisper had written to a third and then a fourth lead slinger. But news travels swiftly even when there are no wires, and Whisper Monahan found himself holding perfectly honest deeds to 4,000 acres of land about as useful as a horned toad's toenails. That, of course, was the penalty for being honest the first time in his life. You see, what made the problem so tough was not Scotty Brandt. Nor was it Swifty Brandt, his son, even though Swifty could bend iron bars with his teeth and knock buttons off a shirt at 50 paces. According to the citizens of Los Hornos, it was Bilbo. About 9 o'clock that night, Whisper took Brazos over to the Oven Saloon via the back entrance and seated him at a table in the shadowy depths of the back. Scotty, Swifty, and Bilbo were sitting near the front door, as befitted members of the superior class of miners.
That him?
Said Brazos, looking with some amusement at the shriveled and harmless-looking little Scot.
That's him.
Brazos studied the group in a while. He was not impressed by Scotty, but the big, heavy-looking youth with the truculent glare was more to Brazos's idea of a menace.
That's Swifty Brandt, the old man's kid. He's hell with a gun, and he's been known to break a man's spine with his 2 hands.
Say, I thought there was just one you wanted dead.
That's right. Only you gotta get 2 in order to be safe in killing the one. You gotta protect yourself, see?
Yeah. And who's the black one?
Before Whisper could answer, Bill Slocum, stringy and, as usual, drunk, came lurching up to them and fell into a chair.
Friend of yours, Whisper?
Yeah.
Yeah, and when he said, who's the black one, was he talking about Bilbo?
Yeah.
Bill Slocum leaned over to Brazos in a confidential manner.
That ain't no black man. Just look at him again, stranger.
Brazos looked. Bilbo was not sitting at the table with his employers. He was hunkered against the wall, regarding the room with an absent stare as though involved in all manner of problems. Now that one regarded Bilbo closely, there was something odd about the man. He was wearing a pair of ragged jeans, but no shirt. His feet were bare. About his throat hung a necklace of human teeth that gleamed dully. He was taller than either Scotty or Swifty and was very thin. There was a nobility about the man which not even Brazos could mistake. Why, the hombre even seemed to disdain his present company.
Just look at him, stranger. He was owned by that there Scotty Brandt down in Louisiana before the war. And he just plain won't leave the old man. And he ain't no ordinary coffee gent, stranger.
Bill Slocum gave Bilbo a half-frightened glance and then lowered his voice even further.
I tell you what he is. He's a witch doctor. Voodoo. That's what it is. Voodoo.
Go get yourself a drink. On me.
He's a witch doctor. That's what.
Said Bill Slocum, not moving except to take Whisper's personal drink and down it.
Fellas was trying to get Scotty 2 years ago. Black magic. 3 fellers dead. Not a bullet in them.
That's a lie.
Fact. They was hexed. That's what they was. Hexed. And then what happened here last 2-3 months? Whiskey Pete come down here to shoot up Scotty Brandt, and Whiskey Pete got out there in the street when young Swifty wasn't around. And Whiskey Pete tain't old Scotty until Scotty drawed. And then what? Why, that there Bilbo just kind of moved his hand like, and Whiskey Pete was paralyzed. He couldn't even draw. He just stood there, a-gawping, and let Scotty put 6 slugs in him. Now and then another fellow come down, and he tried from the same angle. And as soon as he begun to shoot at Scotty, old Bilbo made a motion with his hand, and this gunslinger went stone blind, shot up the front of this here saloon. Never even tried to hit Scotty. Of course, Scotty got him cold. Black magic. Bash what? He was hexed. Witch doctor, that Bilbo.
And Slocum took himself away from there. For several seconds, Brazos fingered his silver cross, his askew mouth tight. Then he said,
No dice, Whisper. I ain't a-going to do it.
Well, suit yourself, Brazos. Suit yourself. If you want that posse to pick you up when they come traipsing back here after losing Henry, why, that's your business.
Brazos sensed rather than saw the derringer which Whisper was holding under the table.
You ain't superstitious, are you, Brazos?
No, I ain't superstitious, Whisper.
Just get the brown man first, and then Swifty, and then you got Scotty.
All right, Whisper.
Usually they leave Bilbo in town to bring out the morning mail. About 1 o'clock, you slip around to the stable where Bilbo sleeps and give him a quick dose of lead. Got me, Brazos?
Yeah, sure.
Good.
Brazos, the color and texture of sun-baked brick, was not generally given to nerves. In fact, Brazos could generally look at an opponent and find bravado enough to grin a bit between shots. Brazos had been raised in a very dark school, wherein a dead man was a man safe. And now all he had to do was use his expert skill to the end of putting 3 shots into 3 men, and he would collect $200 and be able to hie himself southward over the border and beyond the reach of those who had objected so surprisingly to the demise of a mere banker. But somehow, catfooting down the street through the pre-dawn dark toward the marked stable, Brazos did not in the least feel like grinning. His fingers, time and again, sought for the little silver cross at his throat. A silver cross, he argued now to himself, would certainly ward off anything so pagan and wicked as voodoo. Of course, he'd heard quite a bit about voodoo back in Louisiana, and maybe he had even put a little stock in it. But a silver cross? Well, what the devil did he have to be afraid of from a mere witch doctor? And maybe the guy wasn't a witch doctor after all. Maybe he didn't have a thing to do with the fate which had overtaken the 5 men who had attempted the life of Scotty Brant and son. Maybe this Brant was pretty fast and furious with a gun and just played clumsy to cover it up. Certainly, Scotty Brant had all the nerve there was, sitting at the headwaters of a creek and wrecking the water supply of a whole valley with his blasted cyanide. Sure, it was just Scotty Brant. Or was it? The stable loomed like a cube of coal against the brilliant stars. A desert wind, chill as mountain water, was making little sighing sounds through the chinks. This was a very easy job. All he had to do was step inside. He eased through the door, gun in hand. He had a vast contempt for greasers because they were so ungentlemanly as to use steel and prefer a man's back. A horse was munching thoughtfully at his manger, and at the back of the place another restlessly stamped. Gentle snores emanated from a box stall, spotting a sleeping man. Brazos' hand sought the silver cross for one last reassuring touch, and then dipped into his pocket for a match. It wouldn't do to go killing the wrong man. On silent boots he advanced upon the stall. The hinges of the door creaked, and some oats scattered on the floor when brushed back, making a grating sound. A horse snorted and then went on eating. A pale star gleamed through a hole in the roof, sending down the faintest possible beam to the reposed face of the snoring man. Brazos sought to strike the match against the seat of his pants and was immediately disgusted with himself for the way he was shaking. What was wrong with him? All he had to do was kill the man. He'd heard somewhere that gunmen usually got themselves a violent case of nerves toward the end of a career. Maybe he was getting those same nerves. It couldn't be because this black man was a witch doctor, for it was just local talk, that witch doctor business. He wouldn't take any stock in that. Hell no. He struck a match. In the leaping flare of it, Bilbo started up, hand instantly clenched about the hilt of a cane knife, teeth gleaming. Brazos fired. Bilbo swung the knife so fast that it shrieked. Brazos fired. Black hands clutched at Brazos' shirt, and the knife clattered down at one end of the stall. The match was out, but Brazos couldn't miss his target. 3 times, close together, he stabbed the muzzle of the peacemaker deep into the hard black body and pulled the trigger. The reports were muffled. The black hands contracted on Brazos' throat with fury.
I get you! I get you! I get you, white man! I get you!
With a hoarse, rattling sound, Bilbo slumped to the center of the stall. His hands, when Brazos lighted a second match, were still contracting and releasing convulsively, and the jaw was still working. And in the air there seemed to hover the words,
I get you, white man!
Brazos, trembling so that he could hardly move, fumbled his way out of the stable, half crawled, half ran through the sand. Quivering in every muscle, he flung himself gasping in the protection of a sage and stared with haunted eyes in the direction of the stable, 200 yards away.
I get you, white man!
God in heaven! A bullet through the skull on the first shot, a bullet through the heart, and still fighting. 3 bullets in the stomach, so close that the odor of seared flesh still clung in his nostrils.
I get you, white man!
Brazos shakingly fingered the cross. At the funeral, only 2 men had anything to say, although half the town attended. Sheep herders, a few punchers, 4 miners, and Scotty and Son filled the audience. The local undertaker and the preacher went through their motions with mechanical precision born of much practice, and so the blanket-wrapped corpse of Bilbo was lowered into the red earth of the hilltop. Brazos, feeling oddly uncomfortable, was across the circle from Whisper. Just why Brazos had come was a puzzle to Brazos himself, but he had come, and now he was very busy telling himself that dead men were dead men, and that Bilbo was about the deadest corpse he had ever seen. The spectators had just begun to straggle away when Scotty Brant hooked his thumbs into his cartridge belt and bent a pale old eye upon his boy, who was about a foot taller than he.
You have any idea who might have done this, Swifty?
Swifty spat tobacco juice near the boot of a sheepherder and then looked around at the crowd, which had now paused. Swifty's big muscles bulged as he flexed his arms carelessly. The wind was in his blonde hair, and his not unhandsome face was very hard. His boots were planted so solidly that he himself appeared to be growing up out of the earth itself.
No, I ain't got any idea, Pop. But all I gotta say is, God help whoever did it.
If Swifty had suggestively rested a hand on the butt of his gun when he said it, it would have had far less effect. But Swifty didn't appear to be talking about anything he and Pop would do. He seemed to be drawing up vengeance from a source which was now being covered up with red earth and hard stones. And Swifty looked all around and down into the grave, and then took Scotty by the arm and led him toward their horses. Their flat-heeled miners' boots made the only sound. When they had gone, the spectators straggling down the ugly hill buzzed with wonder. Brazos in their midst tried not to listen. Why the devil had he come to this funeral anyhow? Chattering old women, that's what they were, magpies. One was saying that it must have took an awful lot of nerve to kill a witch doctor, and another was saying, yes, that there was no telling what the ghost of a witch doctor might do, and somebody else was whispering about curses and spells and 5 men dead. Brazos gradually worked himself into a fury against such blather. It was as if they were all trying to scare him to death on purpose. Well, let them try. He wouldn't scare. That Swifty might be 8 feet tall for all he cared. He'd salted down jets that had more on the powder than that Swifty. Besides, what did he have to fear from a pink-faced kid? Let him talk. And to hell with him. Brazos wouldn't scare, and that was all there was to it. Amen. Having goaded himself into a state of stubborn determination, very little could have affected him, even the strange thing which he was about to notice. At first, he merely sensed someone walking a little behind him and to his right. What of it? There were a lot of people walking through the weeds down this hill. Probably Whisper wanted to catch up to him and make sure he wasn't losing his nerve. That thought caused him to whirl about with an angry statement ready. But there wasn't anyone walking behind him, nor to his right or left.
Huh. So I am getting spooky.
And thereupon, he refortified his determination to stay as calm as an oyster. Still, there was that feeling that somebody was walking behind and to his right. Well, to hell with it. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of looking. Say, what the devil? Well, this was a nutty one. He had 2 shadows. Somebody had sneaked up behind after all. So thinking, he halted and looked all around. But he was still very much alone, having drawn farther than ever from the main crowd. Yes, and there was Whisper walking between the preacher and the undertaker nearly 100 yards away. He put his back to the sun and looked at the earth. 2 shadows, his own and... Say, what the hell was this all about anyway? He moved his right arm and his own shadow moved. The other one did not. He tipped his hat a trifle and his own shadow did the same. Still, the other did not move. It just lay there a little to the right of his own, a dark black patch upon the whiteness of the sand, not moving, not doing anything but standing there. Experimentally, Brazos took a few steps forward. The second shadow went right along with him. Brazos stopped. His own shadow stopped. The other shadow stopped. Brazos inspected the thing carefully. It wasn't like the kind of shadow that is thrown by a man who had 2 light sources behind him, the kind which starts out in separate directions from one set of feet. No, this one was quite independent of Brazos so far as source was concerned. And there was something else about it. Its shape was indeterminate, lacking any definite outline beyond the vague outline of a man. For a moment he pondered. For an instant he felt a growing surge of terror inside himself, and then he wrapped his fingers around his silver cross and got mad.
Get the hell out of the way.
The second shadow just stood there.
Grab leather.
And though he made as if to charge it, it kept right on standing there.
To hell with it,
said Brazos. With a grand air of indifference, went strolling off toward the town, resisting the impulse to look at it. A man's eyes, however, take in considerable territory, and there he could see it no matter if he didn't look at it. Suddenly he whipped off his hat and threw it at the thing. The hat kicked up a little dust, rolled over, and was still.
Huh.
He reached gingerly across the second shadow and retrieved his headgear. Replacing it, he went on toward the town. He didn't know what it was. He doubted his chances of finding out. All right, he had 2 shadows. He had 2 shadows, but only one did things when he did things. All right, to hell with the second shadow. And if it thought he was going to go loco, it had another think coming.
Go to hell.
And spat at the dark splotch. He was ever so slightly disconcerted when the thing jerked aside, avoiding the tobacco juice.
Well, go to hell anyway. I don't scare, see?
But he felt a little funny about it now from a self-conscious point of view. A fine thing to go walking around with 2 shadows. Gents would kid him. If he knew what was good for him, he'd stay in the shade. As soon as he got into the edge of the town, he followed his plan. It was a relief to see the second shadow go as soon as there ceased to be sun. And not having scared, Brazos swanked a trifle to himself. He pretended not to notice that his course toward the Star livery stable was circuitously plotted so as to keep him in shade, a difficult course, for he had to go in at a side door, the sun shining full into the front.
That you, Brazos?
Yep.
Whisper had seated himself in the main doorway, but now he swiveled around and peered into the gloomy quiet of the stable.
What you doing?
Fixing my saddle.
Well, let it go. The sheriff wants to talk to you.
Brazos unwillingly edged toward the sunlight at the front of the building. He came to the last outpost of darkness and paused, still several feet from the visitors.
Well, come on.
Oh, what do you want to give me? Sunstroke?
The sheriff hefted at his paunch in the guise of hefting his guns.
You Brazos?
Yeah.
Know anything about that Bilbo?
Nope.
The sheriff glanced at his two deputies and for an instant seemed uncomfortable. Indeed, the way Brazos' mouth slanted off and the look in Brazos' eyes and the compact, self-assured way he had of standing, an attitude which seemed battlesome, took some of the authority from the sheriff's voice.
We was just checking up and you being a stranger.
Yeah, that's all right. No hard feelings.
Huh? I mean,
The sheriff moved uneasily.
yeah, no hard feelings. Come on, boys.
They went away, and Brazos promptly moved back into the livery stable, Whisper tagging him.
What's the matter with you?
You got that 200 in cash?
Sure, but
Well, you're coming along with me to pay off.
me? When?
Right now.
Hey, wait a minute, Brazos. There ain't no call to rush this thing. The Brants will be all keyed up and ready for fighting, and hell, Brazos, I ain't no good when it comes to throwing lead.
You're saying it, but you are too good on throwing cash, and I want you handy.
He was busy saddling a roan and was definitely in no mood to argue the point. It was a very hot afternoon, and Whisper sighed at the thought of a sweaty, gritty gallop. But he was also thinking about the thick sheaf of deeds which would become valid and useful as soon as he saw the Brants safely over the border into the happy hunting ground where all would be pay dirt. Whisper called to Henry for a horse, and presently he and Brazos were trotting along the road which led to the Highland Queen mine. Brazos was being very quiet. For one thing, he had to keep a close rein on his thoughts. For another, he didn't like talking to Whisper anyway. The second shadow was still there to plague him, for someone or something was apparently riding the roan with him. Brazos nursed a feeling of outraged pride that a shadow would come along and attach itself to him in so careless a fashion. And he nursed that pride carefully, for with increasing frequency the thought that Bilbo caused this fought for recognition. Bilbo! To hell with Bilbo! A dead man was harmless. And what if it was Bilbo? What if it was Bilbo's shadow? Bilbo's shadow. Say, that would be a funny one. They buried Bilbo, but they didn't bury his shadow. And now the shadow had to attach itself to another hombre. Brazos' quirt fell suddenly and viciously, and the roan spurted ahead. Why, think about it. To hell with it. To hell with Bilbo, and to hell with the Brants, and to hell with Whisper Monaghan. He'd show the whole crew. He'd show them if they could buffalo him. Sure, it was Bilbo's shadow. It wasn't wearing either a hat or a shirt, and below the shadow of the roan, the ragged ends of the jeans could be seen to flap. Brazos slowed down and steadied himself. This was no way to act. Why had he speeded up that way? Oh, so Whisper wouldn't notice this second shadow and comment on it. That was the reason. Well, Whisper was beginning to sweat lard in this heat, and his mind was on his tender sensibilities. And what the hell did it matter if Whisper did see that second shadow? Rage, like the glowing end of a fuse, was beginning to eat its way nearer the powder keg of his temper. He'd ride hard and get to the Highland Queen about the same time as the Brants. They wouldn't be expecting a bushwhack so close to Bilbo's death. Then he'd make Whisper come across with a 200 and maybe a bonus and scorched trail for the border. Somehow it seemed to him that if he got the 2 Brants, the shadow would desert him. He had to be certain of that. Sure, it would leave him.
What's the hurry?
Along the distance which steadily grew between them.
I got 2 funerals to do.
They were coming into broken country now. Brazos could see the defiled stream off to his left, a glass thread wandering off to be soaked up by the greedy desert. At the head of it would be the Highland Queen, and if he began to take the game trails through these broken canyons which led that way, he would come in upon the mine at its flank. Whisperer had already outlined the country to him, and Brazos had a deep instinct for such things. His timing would be perfect, for he was riding the roan for all it had, and he had seen how leisurely the Brants had begun their return. Get over this, he told himself. Get over this and get rid of that shadow and depart this land so fast the jackrabbits would be jealous and the trail would smoke. Whisper became a dust cloud behind him, and then nothing. Ahead, backed by a perpendicular palisade of multicolored rock, the Highland Queen came into sight. It was a shaft in the cliff like a bullseye on a target. A scattering of weathered buildings, a white and yellow dump leading down to the street, a couple mule cars, and a stamp mill, which at first glance looked extraordinarily like a gallows, complete with criminals in chains. Only one man was in sight, laying in the shade of the cook shack, legs crossed and playing upon a harmonica with his own amusement. Brazos drew up. He had approached from the upper trail, and now he was 50 or 60 feet upon the level of the mine, standing in the bed of a stream which had once fed the main creek in years past. From this place, he could command the entire mine and the trail which led into it from town. He swung down and tethered his roan to the breeze. He pulled his Henry from his saddle boot and inspected its load. Then, selecting a rock, which was screened by a sage, he climbed up and prepared to wait. He refused to pay any attention at all to the shadow, even though it stayed very close to him, even though it quite apparently had smooth, round head and was very thin and wore nothing but ragged jeans. To hell with it. As soon as he got the Brants, the thing would vanish. So why worry about it now? He estimated his range to the trail as 175 yards and set his sights accordingly. It annoyed him to find that his hands were shaking. He ought to have brought a drink along to steady him. Still, 175 yards was an easy range. That trail along with the Brants would come stretched without cover for nearly 1/8 of a mile. Of course, there was a dip on the other side of it, for it followed the near side of the gully. But he knew anything about this quarry. They would speed up in an effort to make the mine itself rather than to pile off into the dirt and take cover. Besides, they were just miners, not fighting men. He looked around for Whisper and found the shadow lying beside him. He made an annoyed brush motion at it, but it did not stir. Where was Whisper? Huh? Guess he got cold feet, thought Brazos. Well, he'd be handy when the shooting was over. He better be. The waiting tried him almost beyond endurance. Why the hell did they? There they were. There they were, riding into sight, wholly oblivious of what was waiting for them when they got midway on the trail. This was more like it. He was taking a chance, of course, because one of them might possibly drop into the gully and start banging away. And if that happened, maybe there would be a black man with guns at the mine to smoke him from that angle. But he shot fast and true. He didn't have anything to worry about. The men at the mine wouldn't attempt a battle if their two bosses were dead, for even if they did, they would lack leadership, and a few well-placed shots would drive them back. There were the Brants jogging along at an even pace. Brazos couldn't have asked for anything better. He would lead them by their own wits, and that would be just about land the shots true. The sun had treated up the barrel off the carbine, but it had actually burned him, for it was doubtful he would have noticed. Generally, when he came to near the kill, he was as calm as a buzzard. Usually this sort of thing had a steady effect upon him, but now he was somewhat surprised when he drew his bead on Swifty to find that Swifty was wobbling. No, it wasn't Swifty that was wobbling. It was the Marty Henry. What the hell was wrong with him? Shaking with the guns in his hands? Impossible. Not Brazos, and yet Swifty's image persisted in jumping about beyond the black exclamation point of the front sight. Steady, Brazos told himself angrily. Steady! He moved his arm so that his elbow had better support, but even that didn't help much matters. He was getting old or something. Well, he couldn't try to hold the bead at all day. He'd catch Swifty's image as it went by. Bam! The white powdered smoke boomed before him, and he jacked another cartridge into the heated breech. As soon as that smoke cleared, he saw Swifty's horse, riderless, careening insanely toward the bunkhouses. Well, that's better. Old Scotty's mount was rearing, wheeling on its hind legs and screaming. That was a weird one, but Brazos was in no mood to ask himself questions just then. He drew a bead on Scotty Brant. The target would not be anticipated, so sudden was its movement, and Brazos found that the gun still shook. And then calamity. Old Scotty went off his horse like a catapulted rock and vanished into the gully. Smoke from the gully. Zing! Hard by Brazos. Bang! From the rifle Scotty had just fired. Maybe the old fool wasn't a bad fighter after all, though, thought Brazos easily. He had stayed his mount long enough to pull his gun from its saddle boot. That must have taken nerve. Bam! He saw rock chips fly from the road before his own smoke obscured his view. That would keep the fool down. His brass empty, tinkled musically upon the stone as he jacked another cartridge. Bam! No dust this time. Zing! A puff. Bang! Bam! Right through the old man's smoke, exulted Brazos. If that shot didn't hit him, then he'd better stick to stud the rest of his life and leave shooting to soldiers. He'd wait now and find out. Zing! Scree! Zing! Puffs of smoke were coming from the bunkhouse, and Brazos bethought himself that the top of this rock was nothing to hold that with fire than that direction. He scrambled back and dropped to the dirt at the rock's edge, and from which point he would keep an eye on the trail. Almost absently, he pumped 3 shots into the bunkhouse, waiting to see if Scotty would come up out of the gully or if he'd shoot once more. The bunkhouse crew didn't have anything to fire at now, but it kept firing anyway. Though where the shots went, not even Brazos could tell for he heard no slightest whisper of them. He continued to wait. The old man might be crawling up the gully toward the bunkhouse. Yes, that's what he must be doing if he wasn't dead. But was he dead? And for that matter, had he hit Swifty? Maybe that shot was what had made Scotty's horse go into its dance. Maybe Swifty, covered by Brazos' own smoke, had unloaded himself into the ditch, but without his rifle? Asking himself riddles, Brazos waited for a further sign. Minutes were slipping away to become an hour, and still nothing untoward had happened. There was no increase in the accuracy of the fire from the bunkhouse, and no decrease in the number of weapons firing from there. It began to appear that he had gotten Swifty at least, for Swifty would have tried something besides target practice. Still, maybe he hadn't gotten Swifty. Best thing to do was back out of this and make a circuit of the mine and get a look down that ditch. Then he'd collect his 200. Bow! Bow! Bam! Brazos rolled under this edge of the rock and peered back and up. Who the devil was shooting behind him and why? He'd heard no passage of bullets, though. Whisper. Sure that old gink was going to cover his retreat. Well, 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 thought Brazos. Didn't think that old goof had it in him. Those 3 shots must have done some good, for the 3 rifles in the bunkhouse ceased firing. Maybe old Whisper had done something after all. Experimentally, Brazos slithered out of his concealment and up through the sage toward his waiting horse. As soon as he was covered from the mine by rocks, he stood up to a shock. He had 3 shadows. His own, Bilbo's, and yet another. The new one was of vague size. It didn't focus well. He was conscious of alternate waves of heat and chill sweeping up and down his spine. He felt his palms grow slippery. The band of his hat was suddenly hot, and he took his headgear and swabbed it with a bandana. His own shadow also took off its hat and swabbed it, but the other two just stood there. They walked forward with him. He stopped, they stopped. He forced down a wild craving to mount and run.
Go to hell,
said Brazos, starting toward the roam.
Go to hell, both of you. I don't scare, see? Get that? I don't scare.
2 shadows now. One was Bilbo's, the other was Swifty's. Vague, but so he'd gotten Swifty.
You ain't anything to brag about,
he told the new shadow.
I knocked you off your damn horse like you was so much scarecrow. And if I'm good enough to get both of you, then damned if I can be scared by your shadows. Go on off and crawl in a hole. I don't scare, see?
Truculently, he mounted the roan. He had finished the job. As soon as he got Scotty as well, these things would vanish. Maybe. Well, what if they didn't vanish? 3 shadows instead of 1? Couldn't worry him. Even if they showed themselves as getting on his horse with him, yes, they were. 1 before, 1 behind.
Go to hell,
said Brazos, and turned the roan down the back trail. There was no more firing from that bunkhouse or from the cliffs on his side. He guessed Whisper would be waiting for him around the bend. Well, he'd just scout that mine again and make sure of Scotty. Shucks. Why, he hadn't thought of that before. He nicked Scotty. Sure he had, and almost likely in the head. So Scotty was probably kicking out of his life in that ditch over there. Well, he'd have to make sure. And as soon as he did he collect from Whisper and get himself lost in Mexico. Sure, he made Whisper come around to the other side of the mine, and he'd show him the bodies, and all would be well. As soon as the old man kicked out his last, why, these 3 shadows would just have to vanish. Maybe they wouldn't vanish.
Go to hell. Soon as the old man joins you, that'll be the end of you. I said so.
He rode on along the stream bed on the watch for Whisper. He'd take him around to the other side. What the devil was that in the trail? He stood in his stirrups and gazed steadily, but all he could see was a dark something fluttering in the hot wind. It was obscured by 2 rocks in such a way that he would have to come nearly upon it before he could make it out. An alarm gong began to resound in the back of his brain. His hand on the reins shook and tightened until the roan backed and White-Eyed tried to buck.
Nerves.
There were 3 shadows, his own and 2 more. Bilbo and Swifty. Bilbo and Swifty dead, and here he was getting the shakes like a man after a 10-day drunk. What were a couple of extra shadows? He'd show them that he couldn't be scared, and he set his askew mouth and hardened his unholy eyes and dug spur. The dark thing possessed itself a pair of vaguely familiar legs. Then a hat could be seen lying with partly reddened brim a few feet beyond the first rock. Way down the canyon, a horse was calmly grazing. Brazos reined viciously beside the body and looked down. Cloudy as were his thoughts, strained his vision, he still could not mistake this corpse, blown away though the face might be. Whisper, whisper Monahan. What the devil? The roan had shied away from the body, and Brazos fought to keep control, but he fought with little cunning and assurance, and his spurs betrayed him. He rolled in the dust, and the roan went thundering down the canyon and away. Brazos came to his knees with a curse, wiping the dust from his eyes. Something glinted behind a boulder above him, and he stiffened. There was something familiar about the face behind that barrel. A sound grated in back of him, and he spun about to see another head behind another rock. Something familiar there. As he put out his hand to steady himself, he touched the soft corpse of Whisper Monahan. Not until then did he know what had happened to him. That had been Bilbo's shadow, but the third had not been Swifty's. Not Swifty's at all, but that of Whisper Monahan. Brazos remembered now how it had been elusive in size and shape. Brazos knew with sudden starkness that his fear-crazed bravado had deceived himself.
I'll get you, white man.
Elusive, hammering, torturing words damning him. Brazos. Bilbo's shadow. Where was it now? Where had it gone? That thing which had unnerved him until he couldn't shoot and couldn't think. Where? Gone? He stared up at the living Swifty and saw the gun flame. He swiveled half around and a .44 mangled through his chest from Scotty Brant's gun. His hands clutched meaningless scoops of hot, gritty sand, and the world began to tip crazily. Bilbo's shadow was gone. Whisper Monahan's shadow was gone. With merciless accuracy, the two rifles crashed out again and again, butchering him. His own shadow was gone.